So I want you to imagine that you live in a world where a dominant narrative is being spun, and people who don't conform to this narrative are suppressed, they have their rights taken away, they are regarded as essentially enemies of whoever is spinning this narrative. Now, the reason you would recognize this kind of world I'm painting is either because you're Winston Smith and you can't go anywhere without seeing big fucking posters of Big Brother with his mustache everywhere, or you've related it to the title of the video. And social justice really relates to 1984 and ideas about Big Brother in two key ways. Now, the first is that they are spinning this kind of narrative, and they will suppress you if you disagree with their narrative, and they will regard you as unequal, as their enemy, essentially. But the second key way in which it relates to it is that this is how they see the world. They think that this kind of narrative is being spun against them by this ubiquitous oppressor class, and they attribute inequities between groups, be it on race, class, or gender, to this kind of oppression. And we have what we might call the discrimination hypothesis. But the more you look at the evidence and the more you look into it, the less this discrimination hypothesis actually stands up to scrutiny. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about with this kind of narrative, a lot of people in the social justice movement, well, I'd say all of them in fact, think black unemployment is attributed to racism. They think racism is the cause of black unemployment in comparison to whites, and sometimes they'll even bring up the legacy of slavery. Now, I'm not saying racism doesn't exist and isn't a problem. I think it still is in the United States, but it's not the institutional, ubiquitous thing that social justice individuals claim that it is, and it's not the thing uniformly keeping black people down. If we look at Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals and Race, he says, black labour force participation rates were higher than that of whites generations ago. Black unemployment rates were lower than that of whites in 1890 and for the last time in 1930. And then he goes on to say how black unemployment was lower than, among teenagers, was lower than white unemployment among teenagers up until 1948. And Thomas Sowell attributes this explosion in black unemployment to the introduction of the minimum wage. Now, to me, that's a bit of a dubious explanation. I don't buy into it totally, but it probably has some explanatory power. But the main point here is that this disrupts the discrimination hypothesis, because in a time, 1890 to 1930, I'm sure racism was almost universal back then. I could be wrong, but the fact that blacks were able to essentially prosper in a situation like this disrupts the discrimination hypothesis, and it goes to show that discrimination, even where it occurs, is not usually a sufficient enough force to keep a certain group down, and to keep them with high unemployment rates and low wages and terrible living conditions. It's the same if you look at whites and Hispanics. Whites have a median age, as of 2012, they have a median age almost a decade ahead of Hispanics. And we live in an economy that's placing increasing emphasis on things like information and experience over the sort of manpower and brawn that younger people will have at their disposal. So you have demographic factors like this that have nothing to do with discrimination, and it explains why whites would have this edge over Hispanics. And it's this kind of thing that you need to look at in order to realise just why this narrative that they're spinning is bullshit. You only need to look at the performance of certain minorities and marginalised groups in other areas of the world to see how the discrimination hypothesis doesn't stand up to scrutiny. The Jews in Eastern Europe, the Lebanese in West Africa, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Indians in Fiji, all of these were minorities, and all of them were oppressed in some way by the dominant ethnicity of the areas in which they lived. But they still prospered. They still had the skills necessary to survive and to take the edge over the ethnicities that in some cases were oppressing them. And the stuff that comes out of social justice warriors' mouths can't account for this. It doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever. It is all bullshit, everything they say. And one of the worst things that they do is when they talk about Africa and they attribute it to evil fucking Europeans and the slave trade and colonialism and all the horrible things that white people tend to do. But what they don't tend to realise is that Africans themselves had a significant role in slavery. The slave trade wouldn't have been able to survive and prosper without them. Most notably the kingdoms of Dahomey and Oyo in what is now Benin, and the Ashanti in Ghana. And it's just insane that they tend to attribute colonialism and slavery as a phenomenon that only comes from evil white Europeans. And there's a book by William Easterly called The Tyranny of Experts, and he looks into how nations develop and how they prosper, and he discusses the slave trade, and there's one passage that's particularly important to the discussion at hand. The Aja lived close to the coast and close to African kingdoms that captured slaves and sold them to Europeans, specifically the kingdoms of Dahomey and Oyo. While we usually might think of the slave trade as the product of evil Europeans, it was also the product of evil Africans. The profits of the sugar boom brought out the worst in everyone, splitting West Africans into victims and victimizers. The kingdoms of Dahomey and Oyo grew rich on their sale of slaves, which enabled them to buy ever more guns, which enabled them to seize more slaves. And he goes on to say how the stretch of the West African coast where the Aja lived would appear on European maps of Africa for several centuries as the slave coast. And although the Aja were not a very large group, they accounted for 1 out of every 12 slaves that crossed the Atlantic. And this kind of relationship between what we might call evil Europeans and evil Africans had long-running consequences for the Aja people. And Easterly goes on to say, although the victimization of the Aja was mostly over by 1800, the Aja turned out to have long memories. They scored exceptionally low values of trust today towards other ethnic groups and even towards their fellow Aja. It was as if the Aja could remember how their fellow Africans and even their fellow Aja had betrayed them centuries earlier, slipping over the backyard fence one morning and kidnapping a beloved son who was never seen again. And he goes on to mention a study that was done by 2 guys named Nunn and Wanchicon, who studied a large number of households comprising different ethnicities, and they found that ethnicities affected the most by the slave trade tended to have incredibly low levels of trust. Now, I'm not excusing the slave trade, obviously. I'm not saying that evil Europeans don't exist. I'm just saying that Africans also played a role, and it has had long-running consequences for the people of Africa. And if we look at another example in Easterly's books, he talks about Ghana, and the Ashanti Empire in the interior of Ghana in the 1700s and 1800s had conquered and extracted tribute from the coastal Akan peoples and the Yu, and had exported Akan and Yu slaves to Europeans. Ghana had Africa's single highest rate of slave exports per square kilometre of land. And he talks about how even after control of the country shifted ethnicities, even after the Akan people and the Yu people had control of the Ghanan autocracy, there was still ethnic division and oppression, and even economic policies like punitive taxation, as he mentions, on cocoa producers had an ethnic angle, because most cocoa producers were Ashanti and the people leading the country were Akan. And it's this kind of inter-African conflict that has led to so many years of terrible conditions. And this is the truth about colonialism and the slave trade. It wasn't a product of evil white Europeans, it was a product of evil people in general, a product of both political and commercial authoritarianism which overrode the rights of individuals. It's important to note that Africa hasn't always had such a dire history with regards to its economic progress and its capacity to raise living standards. In the 60s and 70s, Africa's economic prospects were incredibly promising, and a lot of commentators thought they might even overtake, Asian countries like South Korea, and look where South Korea is now. So we have to ask, what was it that actually put a stop to African development? And the answer is autocracy and the denial of individual rights. The same kind of authoritarianism we've seen throughout history that ruins countries and fucks up their people. And this brand of authoritarianism has found justifications among the authoritarians, whether they be black African dictators or white European colonialists. There's a guy called Lord Hailey who was the British administrator of India, and he sums it up really rather well. In May 1941, Lord Hailey said, "We should not give our native population cause to complain that when they had asked for bread, we had offered them a vote." Hailey would in 1943 make a heroic extrapolation from such thinking to a sweeping generalization that political liberties are meaningless unless they can be built upon a better foundation of social and economic progress. And of course, this isn't to say, while I'm saying black African dictators are largely responsible both for the slave trade in history and for Africa's terrible state to say, that isn't to say white Europeans have had no part in the impoverishment of certain regions. This passage here details how in Latin America, and specifically Colombia, descendants of Europeans have tried to suppress the non-white majority and keep rights away from them. And it's because they want to protect their own position in society as being at the top. And this really drives home my point that neither white nor black individuals are inherently more likely to be oppressive. The point is that a lack of respect for individual rights and the resulting oppression is a result of unchecked authoritarian power of whatever colour. It doesn't matter whether it's European, whether it's African. Authoritarianism is the issue that has kept people in Latin America, people in Africa, people often in Asia, all around the world, the Middle East especially, from developing. And, well, when it comes to white Europeans, Saga Navicata has a really good video on how we Brits essentially led the charge against slavery and were pivotal in getting slavery abolished practically worldwide. Now, I'll put a link in the description to it, and it's worth checking out because it really does hammer home the point here that colour of skin has nothing to do with it. It's about power, and it always will be. Now, it's also really, really important to note that there are other factors besides authoritarianism that never get mentioned by the social justice community because they don't conform to the narrative. These points are completely ignored because they don't back up this whole idea of white European oppression when it comes to Africa. It doesn't support the narrative that they're trying to spin, and they don't care. The thing is, they don't care. They'll still spin this fucking narrative, despite the fact the evidence completely points in the opposite direction. And what I'm talking about is geography, right? Geography doesn't have any agency. Geography's not going to fucking oppress you. If you end up with shit geography as a country, tough luck. That's the cards you've been dealt, and you're not going to change that. Unless you've got some, serious technology and you can level mountains and, fix rivers and shit. And my favourite contrast is between the Zaire River in Africa and the navigable waterways of Great Britain. The Zaire, as big as it is plagued by things like cascades and rapids and all sorts of things that make it unsuitable for transport and unsuitable to facilitate domestic trade and domestic investment. Whereas the waterways of Great Britain were really rather good at that. We as Brits got dealt a lucky hand with the waterways because we could utilise them really, really well, and they helped facilitate our development as a nation. And there's a paper here relating to geography. However, in practice, the effects of adverse geography and adverse policies are often difficult to disentangle. High risk, high transport costs, and high dependence upon commodity exports are all due to both. The relative importance of macroeconomic and microeconomic policies cannot be quantified because the latter are so poorly proxied in the regression literature. As a result of these problems of attribution, it is not possible to determine from the growth regressions whether slow growth is inevitable in Africa. And the authors go on to note, in our view, while Africa indeed suffers from geographic disadvantages, these are not sufficient to condemn the continent to continued slow growth. So what we have here is that we don't really know whether policies or geography are the main reasons for Africa's impoverishment. And from that, we can't tell whether slow growth in Africa is really quite inevitable, as if they'll never escape from this horrible position that they're currently in. And, of course, policies have something to do with it. Autocracy, you're never going to get prosperous if you've got a government taking all your fucking property and killing people if they disagree with them. But we don't really know how it weighs up, and they're both a problem. Now, you might be thinking back to the first paper that I put up on Africa's growth that showed in the 60s and 70s it was doing really rather well, and then it fell off the cliff from there. And you might ask, well, how does geography account for that? And if we look at another study, we find that since the 1960s, the semi-arid areas of Africa have been in a phase of declining rainfall, While there are no estimates of the output consequences of this decline, it may be significant since agriculture is typically about 1/4 of GDP in the region. Now, this is really important. Declining rainfall is fucking bad for agriculture. Everybody knows this. And the amount of people in Africa involved in agriculture is immense because the lack of infrastructure and the lack of manufacturing means that they don't really have any other options. And the study goes on. Given the lack of irrigation, the unpredictability of rainfall implies high risks in agriculture. With incomplete insurance and a high rate of time preference, households have to use assets for purposes of consumption smoothing rather than investment. Households can thus become trapped in a low-income, high-liquidity equilibria. Now, there's a lot of jargon there, but what this essentially means is that the assets that African households have can't be used for investments to make them more productive in agriculture. They have to use the assets they have to simply survive because rainfall is so unpredictable and they don't know when they're going to pull their next crop in. It's a horrible way to live, but it's not due to any kind of discrimination or oppression. It's just geography. And of course there are other factors relating to geography, such as Africa's high natural endowment of resources. And there's an abstract from a paper here, but basically what the issue is with Africa and its high natural resources is Dutch disease. Now what Dutch disease is when you have heavy exports in one sector, it makes the exports in another sector highly uncompetitive. Russia has also had this problem. Russia's exports are focused primarily in the energy sector. Now, when Russia exports a lot of energy, it appreciates their currency. The price of their export goes up, and in turn, it makes the exports from other areas, weaker areas like manufacturing, a lot less competitive. And the same happens in Africa when they export a lot of natural resources, and manufacturing suffers immensely as a result. And again, not due to any kind of fucking oppression. It's just the way the world is. Also on natural resources, economies with around 1/4 of GDP coming from natural resource exports are acutely at risk at civil conflict. Right, this is a massive issue for Africa. The author of the paper goes on, essentially says that this is due to ease of funding for rebel groups and groups who might be involved in a civil war in Africa. But the point I'm interested in is that this correlation between civil war and natural resources is not a result of oppression. It's a result of geography. And of course, a high rate of ethnic diversity in Africa, not a result of oppression. But if you don't have a democratic government and you have a high rate of ethnic diversity, it makes the government incredibly inefficient. Projects from ethnically diverse countries with autocratic governments are twice as likely to fail as projects in ethnically diverse countries with a democratic government. This is fundamental. Things surrounding authoritarianism, geography, and demography, people, are what accounts for Africa's terrible position. And it's got nothing to do with evil white people. It's got nothing to do with oppression on the basis of race, gender, or class. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with simple authoritarianism and unchecked power. And social justice warriors can't realise this. Indeed, they even advocate a certain kind of authoritarianism in their own way. And it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. So these ideas about white privilege and ubiquitous racism and the horrible history of white Europeans are all wrong. They don't stand up to history. And this isn't to excuse colonialism, but to explain it as a phenomenon in a much larger context. And the three factors I've mentioned, authoritarianism, demographics, and geography, have nothing to do with oppression or discrimination on the basis of race, class, or gender. They have to do with either uncontrollable factors or just general unchecked power of people trying to protect their position at the top of a society. A closely related idea to this concept of white privilege and white European history and all that is cultural appropriation, which is considered a subtle form of oppression whereby white people keep other races and ethnicities down by stealing, quote unquote, stealing their culture. And just to sort of demonstrate to you how ridiculous this is, just think of Japan in the 1800s. Can you think of a country that was more sort of painfully backwards, apart from, some country maybe in Africa, was more painfully aware of its own backwardsness relative to, say, Europeans? Can you imagine what would have happened if these social justice types went over to Japan and told them that there's nothing wrong with your institutions, there's nothing wrong with your culture, all of the hardships you face are the result of discrimination and oppression, and your culture should be placed in a special little box, separate from all other cultures, and, treated as if it were perfect. And these concepts of cultural appropriation are ridiculous. Just think of where Japan would be now if something like that would have happened. And it's coming primarily from students, at least in the UK and the US, it seems. The National Union of Students in Great Britain, in my country, passed a motion condemning gay men for speaking like black women because they were culturally appropriating black women. It's ridiculous. And of course there was the whole thing with Pharrell Williams wearing a Native American headdress, and he was forced to apologise for committing this ridiculous concept of cultural appropriation, despite the fact he was part fucking Native American himself. This is how crazy these social justice types have become. This is the kind of world that we fucking live in now. But aside from social justice concerning race and gender, you also have a more Marxian form of social justice, which assumes that the rich are keeping the working class and lower classes down. And this might seem, at first glance, more sort of intuitively correct, but it still doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Most American millionaires, 80%, are first generation affluent, and their fortunes will have disappeared by the second or third generation. And of course we're seeing record numbers of billionaires agreeing to give at least half of their wealth away to charity. Now, there are legitimate issues with the lower class and the working class, but this has been studied. There's a guy called Robert Putnam who studied this really quite extensively, and what he found was it stems mostly not from malice from the upper class, but from old-fashioned government policies. The drug war, which harshly punishes victimless crimes like smoking a bit of pot, the failure of primary and secondary education, the failure to have an effective welfare state which doesn't trap people in poverty, and even things like the decline of the nuclear family are all factors in keeping poor people poor. This is the issue. And there are legitimate concerns about inequality and favour seeking by the rich, but these don't qualify as these aren't institutional enough or ubiquitous enough to be oppressive. And the problem is that social justice is defined by this subtle and pernicious form of envy, hatred of the successful, because in the social justice paradigm, success is an indicator of being part of the oppressor class. They see it as a case of the haves suppressing the have-nots, and in some cases this is true. The government policies I just mentioned which keep the lower classes down, but it isn't a case of malice. It's just a case of poor, old-fashioned, archaic policies that are still in place because the government has a vested interest in keeping them there, essentially. The conservative lobby when it comes to drugs, primary and secondary education is obviously difficult to fix, and the welfare state is very difficult to reform because you get people from both ends of the spectrum criticising you for it on the basis of what your reforms actually do. And racism and sexism also still exist, and they can be harmful, but they're still not institutional or ubiquitous as the social justice crowd claim that they are. If you get a chance, pick up the sociologist Helmut Schuck's book, Envy, A Theory of Social Behaviour, and look at chapter 4, and he finds something which, well, it shouldn't really be that surprising, but he finds that there's a certain cultural value that permeates all impoverished societies, and that is the fear of people to induce envy in their neighbours, the fear of people to be successful in case they upset their neighbours or make them jealous. And this is the kind of value that social justice propagates, and it's incredibly dangerous. It's just difficult to comprehend why they would want to enforce such a value, this envy and hatred of the successful. And especially in education, we're already beginning to hold back the successful. There was a boy in the 4th grade who scored higher than the average high school graduate on his maths SAT, and the principal said he has to keep taking 4th grade mathematics because he insisted that it would be a violation of the principles of social justice if the boy were given material that wouldn't be mastered by other 4th grade students. This is ridiculous. We're holding people back on the basis of social justice because they're successful, because they have the skills necessary to improve their lives. Personally, I'm more interested in bringing up the bottom than pulling down the top. And social justice just doesn't seem, the social justice crowd doesn't seem to have its priorities straight. There's a book, unfortunately I couldn't find a PDF of it online, but there's a book called A for Admission. And if you look at pages 117 and 118, the author, who's a former admissions officer for colleges in the US, discourages students from talking about their privileged backgrounds in case they rub the admissions officers up the wrong way. Now, of course, you're a bit of a prick if you keep going on about your privileged background, but it's this kind of envy that we see that is being promoted by social justice crowds that is incredibly worrying. And Milo Yiannopoulos made a tweet the other day. I'll put a link to his Twitter feed in the description and you can go find it, about how Asian students in schools in the US are being punished in their test scores while other students are being given advantages on the same kind of bases that we see in social justice and on this principle of envy. And that's what it is. It's a principle to these people. It's central to their ideology. And I can't emphasize just how ridiculous and dangerous this kind of thing is. So, before my head explodes because of a fucking aneurysm or something, I just want to move on to something which isn't race or class, but which is gender. Now, feminists have a tendency to sort of go on about the wage gap rather a lot. And when it comes to things like colonialism and evil white Europeans, it's more sort of acceptable to have thoughts like that. It takes a fair degree of research to sort of put those biases to bed. But when it comes to the gender pay gap, it takes about 5 minutes of research to look at the study. So it's really not forgivable that feminists keep fucking going on about this. And the wage gap is largely explainable in terms of part-time work and full-time work. In men versus women, men tend to do full-time work more. Obviously there's things like motherhood and childbirth and the career choices that women make. But if you're familiar with economics, you'll realise that all the factors I've just mentioned are endogenous. And what that means is these are channels through which discrimination can occur. Social pressures, people not hiring women for full-time work, or, whatever. So we have to look a bit deeper. And what we find is that even in incredibly egalitarian countries like the Netherlands, which this study looks at, there are incredible differences between boys and girls and men and women. We find that competitiveness is strongly positively correlated with choosing more prestigious academic tracks, even conditional on academic ability. Most importantly, we find that the gender difference in competitiveness accounts for a substantial portion, about 20%, of the gender difference in track choice. And among more egalitarian countries, we tend to see a higher degree of auto-segregation in the labour force. So, for instance, this study says, cultural modernity, e.g. gender-progressive attitudes, policies and social practices, often coincides with more, not less, sex segregation overall. In fact, some of the highest levels of occupational sex segregation are found in reputably egalitarian Scandinavian countries, such as Sweden. And you have to ask why that is, and there's a study by the American Psychological Association that answers this question, and it finds that among more egalitarian and more prosperous societies, there are greater personality differences between men and women. And this isn't to say that personality differences don't exist between men and women in poorer countries. It's just that men and women in more prosperous countries have greater opportunity for gendered expression. They can express their gender a lot more freely. And this is because, fundamentally, men and women are formally equal, but innately different. Gender is largely down to biology. I'm not saying there are no social pressures that influence how people act, but gender is largely down to biology. And feminists can't reconcile this, because when they claim they're looking for equality of opportunity, they're lying. What they actually want is parity. They'll say, oh, I want women to have choice, I want women to be liberated. And then they'll look at the number of female CEOs, and they'll say, well, there's obviously a glass ceiling here. But that's the wrong metric to use if you want to look at equality of opportunity. It's more than likely the case that because of the personality differences we find between men and women just don't want to be CEOs. And, looking this stuff up took me 5 fucking minutes. It's ridiculous that people still believe the kind of bollocks that comes out of their mouths. Ultimately, the problem with social justice progressivism is this. It's just another form of authoritarianism. They are willing to throw out the foundational and sacrosanct values that have built our societies. They don't care about your liberty if you disagree with them. If you go to jail because of false rape accusations, it doesn't matter to them. Protecting the victims of rape is all that matters, never mind the presumption of innocence or the rule of law. They don't care about your right to speak or listen freely with regards to whatever viewpoints you or others hold. If it contradicts the dogma, it must be silenced by moralization and, literal appropriation, like when those Black Lives Matter activists took Bernie Sanders' platform. And of course there's a law in Quebec at the moment which could illegalize criticism of Islam, because these progressives are stupid enough to believe radical groups when they say that they're just trying to protect religious liberty. It is ridiculous. They don't care about equality. If you're white or born into some other, quote-unquote privileged position, you have to check that fucking privilege. Otherwise you're a shitlord. Now, I have no problem considering somebody a shitlord for their opinions, but considering somebody a shitlord and thus inferior because they don't do what you tell them to do just because they are white is disgusting. There's no debate about it. It's like, St. Augustine's original sin. We're all seminally present in the loins of Adam, so we're responsible for him fucking eating that apple. It's an uncontrollable aspect of your life which can only be rectified, according to these social justice progressives, by acknowledgement, guilt, and capitulation. And these values are exactly the kind of values that has led to the impoverishment of marginalised groups in the first place. It's just another brand of authoritarianism. And I'm not saying racism, sexism, and classism don't exist, or that such groups don't face occasional hardships due to either bigotry or unfortunate circumstances like those government policies I mentioned earlier. I'm saying this narrative of oppression leads you to completely abandon all the things that make our society free and prosperous. Individuals no longer matter. There are only groups, the oppressed and the oppressors. To these social justice warriors, individuals are just cogs in the machines of war against imaginary oppressors. Individuals are part of the sum of a homogeneously defined group. People are no longer an end in themselves, but treated as a means to an end. Just think about the progressive stack. It doesn't matter what you have to say. If you come from a marginalised group, you get to speak first. Fucking terrible idea. It's immoral, it's disgusting, it's a danger to society. Make no mistake, these people are the enemies of freedom and prosperity everywhere.